She stepped off the stagecoach bleeding. Not screaming, not fainting, just staring straight ahead as if daring the dusty frontier town to look away. And the driver cracked his whip and fled, leaving her boots sinking into red mud that matched the dark stain, spreading down her sleeve. And every instinct in Caleb, Ross told him to stay seated on the saloon bench and mind his own business, because women arrived broken in towns like this, and trouble followed them like wolves. Yet when she swayed, he was already on his feet, catching her before she hit the ground, feeling how light she was, how cold, how fiercely she clung to him, as though he were the last post in a flood. And the crowd that had gathered melted back when they saw the blood wasn't just from a cut, but from a bullet, crease along her ribs, fresh and ugly, the kind meant as a warning, not a mercy. And she whispered a single word into his chest, "Run," before her knees buckled. And Caleb didn't run. He scooped her up, ignoring the sheriff's glare, ignoring the gambler's grin, ignoring the way the town suddenly felt like a trap snapping shut. And he carried her into the stable behind the saloon, laid her in the hay, tore his shirt to press against the wound while her eyes fluttered. And she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and told him men were coming, who didn't miss twice. Men who wore badges when it suited them and masks when it didn't. Men who had killed her husband and sworn she'd be next, because she knew where the ledger was buried. And Caleb felt the world tilt, because the sheriff's boots crunched outside and the woman's blood was already soaking into his hands. And when the stable door creaked open and a shadow fell across them, Caleb did the thing that would damn or save them both. He drew his gun and fired before seeing who stood there. The shot shattered the quiet and the shadow dropped with a grunt, not dead but screaming. And when Caleb realized it was the sheriff's deputy clutching a ruined shoulder, there was no turning back, because the town would call it attempted murder and the law would call it justice. And the woman in the hay forced herself upright, teeth clenched as she pressed her own wound, telling Caleb there was a tunnel beneath the stable, an old smuggler's crawl space that led to the dry wash beyond town. And as bells began ringing and boots thundered outside, Caleb kicked loose a rotted plank and dragged her down into darkness that smelled of earth and secrets, crawling as bullets punched through boards above them, straw raining like fire. And in that narrow black throat she told him her name was Eleanor Pike, and her husband had been an accountant for the railroad, forced to keep 2 sets of books, one clean and one soaked in bribes, land theft and murder. And when he tried to run with the true ledger, they shot him in front of her and let her live only long, enough to lead them to it. But she'd lied, buried the book somewhere only she could find. And now the men hunting them weren't just local thugs but agents with federal warrants ready to burn the town to hide their crimes. And when they burst from the tunnel into the wash, Eleanor collapsed, fevered and shaking, and Caleb hoisted her onto his horse, riding hard as flames rose behind them. The stable set alight to smoke them out, and by dawn they reached his isolated ranch, where he stitched her wound with shaking hands and listened as she begged him to leave her there and save himself. But when riders appeared on the ridge, silhouettes against the sun, Caleb barred the doors, loaded every rifle he owned, and made another choice that sealed their fate. He saddled a second horse, placed Eleanor on it despite her protests, and told her he was taking her straight into the mountains where the ledger was buried, because the only way out now was straight through the truth. The mountains closed around them like jaws, snow already dusting the higher passes, and the riders followed hard, gunshots echoing off stone until Caleb led Eleanor into a dead canyon where she laughed weakly, blood seeping through fresh stitches, and told him this was where her husband had died, where she'd buried the ledger beneath a cairn marked by a twisted pine. And as Caleb dug with bare hands while bullets chipped rock around them, Eleanor confessed the last truth she'd been hiding, that she had never meant to escape alone, that stepping off the stagecoach bleeding was bait, because the men hunting her only trusted blood and panic, and she needed someone like him, someone decent enough to choose the wrong side. And before he could answer, the sheriff emerged from behind the rocks with a rifle and a smile. congratulating Eleanor for leading him straight to the book, admitting he'd ordered the warning shot that hit her, never thinking she'd survive. And as Caleb rose with the ledger in his hands, the sheriff shot him clean through the chest, the impact knocking him into the snow, breath tearing out of him in a red cloud. And Eleanor screamed his name, as if she hadn't planned for this, as if the sound alone might pull him back, but Caleb, choking, shoved the ledger toward her and told her to finish it. And when the sheriff reached for the book, Eleanor drew the small pistol she'd hidden in her boot and shot the sheriff dead, then turned and fired on the remaining riders until silence fell. And she crawled to Caleb, holding him as life slipped away, realizing too late that the man she'd used had given her something she hadn't counted on, a chance to be more than a survivor. And with dawn breaking, Eleanor rode alone down the mountain, ledger strapped to her chest, delivering it to the federal marshal by nightfall, exposing the ring, toppling men who thought themselves untouchable. And months later, when the town built a grave at the edge of the wash for the cowboy who'd stood up once and paid for it with everything, Eleanor stood there, no longer bleeding, no longer running, knowing his next move had changed her life by costing him his own, and she would never waste it. The first winter after the trials came down hard on the valley, and Eleanor returned to the town under a different name, riding in alone the way she had left. But this time the people watched her with a silence edged by guilt. Because the saloon had been rebuilt, the sheriff's office stood empty, and every man who had sworn he knew nothing now knew better. And she walked to the grave by the wash, where the wind cut like a blade, and knelt, telling Caleb everything the newspapers hadn't, how the ledger had cracked open the railroad, how men in suits had begged and threatened in the same breath, how she had refused the reward, money, and taken only enough to buy the ranch outright, because blood money rotted whatever it touched. And as she stood there, she realized the danger hadn't truly passed, because justice made enemies faster than crime ever had. And that night she saw lanterns moving on the ridge, heard hooves where there should have been none, and understood that the story wasn't finished, only quieter. And when a shot shattered her cabin window and missed her by inches, Eleanor didn't run. She took down the rifle Caleb had taught her to use in those last hours, barred the door and waited, knowing some ghosts had to be faced standing still. They came at dawn, 3 men who thought the past belonged to them, and Eleanor met them in the open yard with the mountains at her back, and no fear left to spend, because she had already survived the worst thing a person could lose. And the gunfight was short and brutal, ending with 2 men fleeing and 1 bleeding into the dirt, confessing through broken teeth that they had been sent to make sure she never testified again if new trials were called. And Eleanor let him crawl away alive so the story would spread, so men would know she was no longer bait, no longer prey. And as the sun rose, she burned the last copies of the ledger she had kept hidden, watching the smoke drift over the land Caleb had loved. And in the years that followed, the ranch became a place where stagecoaches stopped without fear, where wounded travelers were fed and sheltered, where a woman who had once stepped off a coach bleeding had turned loss into a line no one dared cross. And when children asked about the grave by the wash, Eleanor told them the truth without polish, that one good choice in a bad moment could change the course of many lives, and that sometimes the bravest move wasn't drawing a gun, but stepping forward when everyone else stepped back.